Good morning, and welcome to the Georgia Coast on a lovely February Saturday morning, yes? My name is Chris Curtis. I'm professor of history at Armstrong State University. For those of you who were not here yesterday, or as after Janice's plea of trepidation for more time, my graduate student referred to me as the conference villain. So. We're going to turn our attention this morning in the two presentations and in the forum to issues that are more contemporary and focus on the coast in today's world. Our first speaker, William Boyd, will look at the role that the paper and pulp industry on the coast of Georgia during the 20th century and the struggle over the use of groundwater. Dr. Boyd is well qualified to discuss the topic. He is an associate professor of law at the University of Colorado Boulder. He received a law degree from Stanford Law and his PhD from the Energy and Resources Group at the University of California, Berkeley. After law school, he clerked for Judge Diana Motz on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. He practiced energy and environmental law with the firm of Covington and Burlington in Washington, D.C., and served as counsel on the U.S. Senate Committee on the Environment and Public Works. Dr. Boyd is also a fellow of the Renewable and Sustainable Energy Institute, which is aligned with the University of Colorado, where he teaches energy law, climate change law, policy, and environmental law. He is the author of many articles and chapters in books. He has appeared on BBC World Service News, written articles for the New York Times, and been part of the delegation of governors looking at the deforestation in Brazil. Most recently, Dr. Boyd's book, published by Johns Hopkins University Press, The Slain Wood, Paper Making and the Environmental Consequences in the American South, appeared last spring. Please join me in welcoming Dr. William Boyd.
Thank you, Chris. Can everyone hear me back there? Okay. I want to thank everyone who's been involved in this. Paul, Elizabeth, Robin, the whole team at Ossabaw, the board from Ossabaw, the sponsors of the symposium, the Barrow family for the lovely reception last night at Wormslow. I am going to make you turn those off when I show some of the slides, though, if that's okay. Thank you. Yeah. And all of you for coming out on a beautiful Saturday morning. I'm really delighted to be here back in Savannah. I'm very happy not to be talking to lawyers. I was a little nervous after Janice's talk last evening. Thought about getting on the plane and heading home because that was so good. That was a perfect talk to end on, but I will try to sort of carry forward here. My title this morning draws on the famous quote attributed to Mark Twain that one hears on a regular basis out west. Whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting over. There's no evidence, of course, that he actually said such a thing, but it's a good story. And I should say that I am not a hydrogeologist and I'm not a historian, but I am here today talking about hydrogeology to historians and others. Only a lawyer would be that stupid. So I do want to spend some time putting the groundwater issue in a larger context and tell you a bit about the pulp and paper industry, which draws a bit on my recent book that Chris mentioned. Now, the book is based on some research I did years ago that drew on fieldwork I did while living here in Savannah in the late 1990s. And I spent a good bit of time at the Georgia Historical Society and up in Athens as well, and really grew to appreciate all of the rich historical resources and the beauty of the coast. I spent most of my life growing in South Carolina and a lot of time on the South Carolina coast, but it is Georgia low country is as good as or better as the South Carolina low country. So this book is an economic and environmental history of the pulp and paper industry in the post-New Deal American South, and I should say a word on the title. I wanted to call it New South, New Nature, because all of my favorite books about the South had New South in it, right? Origins of the New South, emergence of the New South, Old South, New South. Publisher, of course, was like, there's no way we're going to call this thing New South, New Nature. And go check your publishing contract. We get the last word on this. We'd like to call the book Pulped. And so I said, wow, Pulped for my first book. I don't know. I called Paul Sutter and I said, they want to call it Pulped. And he said, in his very diplomatic way, well, I don't know, you might want to go back to that. So we settled on the Slain wood, which most of my colleagues still think is about a heavy metal band. I can promise you there's no heavy metal in here or devil worship or anything like that, but I have not tried to read it backwards yet, so I don't know what happens when you do that. So. The paper I'm presenting today on the paper industry and struggles over groundwater resources in coastal Georgia draws on a lot of the research I did that was part of the dissertation, but ultimately did not really make it into the book in any significant way, so it's great to have the opportunity to talk about some of this here today. And as I said, before I get into the groundwater story, I'd like to say a little bit about the industry and its implications for the South, for the people and the landscapes of the South, and to try to situate this story about groundwater. So this is a map of pulp mill capacity, pulp mills in the United States in 2000. And as you can see, there is a pretty significant concentration of pulp and paper production in the American South. It was not always the case that there was such a concentration. And what I set out to understand in my book was how, over the course of the 20th century, the South came to just absolutely dominate both national and international production of pulp and paper based on the intensive cultivation of timber. To understand the political, economic, social, and ecological dynamics that underwrote this industry and its explosive growth in the post-New Deal period. To think about the political, economic, and environmental history of the region through the story of this industry. So this is really sort of an industrial story, but it's really an environmental history through the story of this industry. Just a few facts. So by the end of the 20th century, the South accounted for about 3/4 of wood pulp production and more than half of paper and paperboard production in the United States. Okay. National dominance translated into international leadership as well. By the late 1990s, the Southern pulp and paper industry was far larger than all other countries in the world, and the South accounted for about half of the world's total acreage of industrial timber plantations. It really is an astonishing story of industrial success. As the global leader in the production of pulp and paper based on the intensive cultivation of timber, the Southern pulp and paper industry clearly represented one of the region's most impressive industrial success stories. Now, I argue that you can't explain this simply as comparative advantage and key factors of production. It took an enormous amount of work to mobilize the productive capacities of Southern land and labor and to integrate them into a highly productive industrial system. This required dealing with vernacular institutions and landscapes, taking hold of those institutions and landscapes and pulling them sometimes violently into this emerging industrial order. This is the International Paper Mill in Georgetown, South Carolina, around 1947 is when this picture was taken. And to understand the story I want to tell you today, we have to start with the mills. We have to start with the machines. We have to go into the hidden abode of production. Right? So these mills were truly massive, right? They were the largest such mills in the world. They represented huge investments in fixed capital, hundreds of millions of dollars of investments. You talk about Yankee money, that's Yankee money on a grand scale, right? And they dwarfed anything the region had ever seen before. Very different than the sawmills that ravaged the southern woods in the decades after Reconstruction that Bert was talking about yesterday. Their appetites for fiber, water, energy, chemicals were difficult to comprehend. They operated under an imperative to keep their fixed capital in motion. Among other things, this required a continuous and dependable supply of timber and very large volumes of high-quality water. So this is the famous paper machine or Fourdrinier machine section of the number 3 liner board machine at the Georgetown, South Carolina mill. My kids give me a hard time when I try to show pictures of actual machines in pulp and paper mills, but they are kind of interesting. This machine was the largest producer of linerboard. Linerboard is cardboard in the world, and it could produce a strip of linerboard 196 inches wide and 1 mile long every 4 minutes. One day's production could cover a highway 16 feet wide from Mobile to Alabama. So the speed and the scale of these mills was just incredible. The Union Bag Plant at Savannah, which I'll show you some pictures of in a minute, was the largest pulp and paper complex in the world during its heyday. And by the early 1970s, the Savannah mill have produced enough paper to manufacture over 230 billion paper bags. According to the company, and I have no idea if this is true, I have not done the calculation, but according to the company, if laid end to end, these bags would have reached from Earth to Venus and back with enough left over to encircle both Earth and Venus almost 100 times, okay? 20% of all the paper bags manufactured in the United States came out of this one mill right here in Savannah, okay? So feeding these mills, right, required massive flows of wood. This is a picture of International Paper's Spring Hill, Louisiana mill. And this picture and that earlier picture I just showed you were both taken by a guy named Gabriel Benzer, who was a photographer for Life magazine. And his son was nice enough to let me use some of the pictures for the book, and he lives in Atlanta. A rough estimate, a 2,000 ton per day capacity mill, which is a fairly large mill, but by no means the largest mills operating in the South. Operating at about 90% capacity would require about a million cords of wood per year, which at average stocking density could give you, would require roughly 100,000 acres of timberland a year to feed these mills. And as I'll discuss in a moment, these mills also used huge amounts of water, 30, 40, 50, 70, even more, 75, 76 million gallons of water a day, every day. And for mills operating in the coastal plain of Georgia, much of that water, the vast majority of that water until quite recently, was drawn from the prolific Floridan aquifer system, okay? Now, this slide takes a minute to load, but it'll come up in a second. There it is. Now, when the paper industry started moving into the South in the 1930s, it was by no means obvious that the region would be able to sustain a large and thriving forest products industry, much less that the region would emerge as the world's leader of industrial forestry. Southern forests suffered widespread destruction at the hands of lumber and naval stores industries during the half century after Reconstruction. This is Burt Way's story from yesterday, driven by the rapid transfer of land to private timber interests at rock-bottom prices and a strong incentive to cut and get out. Southern landscapes also suffered widespread erosion and degradation, as Paul Sutter's new book documents. And the destruction of forests and southern soils often went hand in hand, leaving vast acreages of cutover and marginal lands. By 1920, the cutover area in 13 southern states exceeded 156 million acres. In the Yellow Pine Belt stretching from South Carolina to Texas, less than 24 million acres of old-growth forest out of an estimated 100 million acres remained. In 1920, 7 years later, that figure had been reduced to about 13 million acres. In Georgia, which once boasted as much as 18 million acres of old-growth pine, only 700,000 acres remained in 1920. By 1927, that figure had been reduced by half. One government forester who surveyed the situation at the height of the cutting assessed the situation, assessed it as probably the most rapid and reckless destruction of forests known to history. William Faulkner called it the slain wood. Now, many towns that had grown up to support the industry simply curled up and died, as one observer put it. A 1922 report from the Georgia State Board of Forestry noted that, quote, dismantled mill plants and deserted communities throughout the lumber regions of the state are forbidding reminders of the migration of an industry which, under wise and proper management of our forest lands, should be a permanent and leading industry in the state. By the 1930s, the South was in a protracted economic and ecological crisis, summed up in President Roosevelt's famous characterization of the South as the nation's #1 economic problem. Now, it was against this backdrop that the large pulp and paper companies started to invest in the South. This is the Savannah Union Bag and Paper Mill in 1937 or 38. I think this is a picture by Margaret Bork White, very interesting photographer. And I see a lot of these photos. There's a genre here. I call it industrial high modernism, right, where they're taking pictures of these gigantic machines and dams and other things. She was one of the first women, I think the first female war photographer and the first American photographer into the Soviet Union. Anyway, we could go on and on about that. But these mills started investing in the South in the 30s once they had solved the so-called sap problem, which confirmed that immature southern pines could be used as fiber supply for paper making using the Kraft or sulfate process. And as the preliminary results of the first forest surveys revealed that the southern forest was already regenerating on its own, as Burt mentioned yesterday. Paper companies then started to build these large southern production complexes. Alexander Calder, who was president of the Union Bag and Paper Company, proclaimed upon the opening of Union Bag's new Savannah mill in 1936, quote, "About 5 years ago, I came to the conclusion that the Union Bag and Paper Corporation without a Southern plant would make about as much progress on the road to fame and success as Colonel Lindbergh would have made without an airplane. These new mills were, as I said, massive by the standards of the day. The Union Bag Mill at Savannah would grow to become the largest pulp and paper complex in the world, producing at its peak more than 3,500 tons of paper and paperboard per day. And as the industry expanded in the South, industrial advocates heralded the dawn of a new industrial age. Echoing the boosterism of Henry Grady, the Savannah Morning News proclaimed in 1936 that the Union Bag plant signaled a, quote, new industrial epoch for Southeast Georgia, noting that, quote, the lowly pine tree has taken on a new aura of grandeur and significance as a symbol of vast potential wealth. Speaking at a banquet celebrating the formal opening of the Union Bag plant, Savannah Mayor Thomas Gamble pointed to the vast new opportunities awaiting his city in the South. Quote, no one can safely limit the possibilities which center in the pine tree and its various possible products. We apparently are on the threshold of discoveries which will incalculably broaden the use of products common to our section. The South, especially our own immediate territory, is recognized as a coming industrial empire. A new world seems to be opening before us. Savannah must be prepared to enter and possess it. Savannah's own Dr. Charles Holmes Hardy, who played an important role in promoting the virtues of Southern pine during the 1920s and 1930s, declared in 1933 that someday in the not-too-distant future, King Cotton is going to be replaced by King Pulp. And so it came to be. By the end of 1947, 11 years after Union Bag completed its Savannah mill, Savannah's last cotton compress had been dismantled. King Cotton, which had shaped the fortunes of the city for so long, had been replaced by the pine tree as the staple of regional economic development. As the New York Times put it, the industrializing of the New South is being dramatically illustrated in Savannah as cotton is no longer brought here, and the old river and wharf support a new business that still draws upon the countryside and the farmer. The cotton farmer has been succeeded by the tree farmer in a large section of the South. The pine tree has become the new cash crop. By mid-century, timber had become the region's #1 cash crop, and an earlier logic of extraction, where the southern forest was treated as a mine, was replaced with a new logic of cultivation that treated timber as a crop, and the industrialization of the southern forest was in full swing. This is a Union Camp tree nursery, a picture I took when I was doing my field work. It's not quite Margaret Bourke White, I know, but all of this created an imperative to make trees grow faster and better, to use genetics and tree improvement to increase the biological productivity and harness the southern forest to the dictates of the machine. Improved seedlings, such as these from a Union Camp nursery outside of Savannah, provided the biological foundation for this incredibly successful industry. Between 1940 and 1990, 40 million acres of land were artificially regenerated in the South. Southern nurseries produced over 23 billion tree seedlings, the vast majority of which since 1980 were genetically improved. So the South became, quite quickly over the post-war period, provided the home to the most thoroughly industrialized forest in the world. Now, making trees grow faster and better, industrializing the southern forest, making timber the region's #1 cash crop. All of these were instrumental in the paper mill's efforts to ensure cheap and dependable supplies of fiber. But the mills also had to find ways to secure access to the timber owned by the thousands of small non-industrial private timber landowners, Although the mills owned and controlled or leased large tracts of timberland. Union Bag, for example, owned or controlled considerably more than 400,000 acres in the area around its Savannah mill. The bulk of the fiber, though, coming into these mills was coming from small, non-industrial private landowners, about 2/3 in many parts of the South. And so the mills had to find ways to access that timber on a dependable basis. They also had to find ways to tap into rural labor markets in order to organize and manage a logging force that could respond in a flexible way to changing wood demands and access the many and varied tracts of timber across the region. And so the southern paper mills devised what came to be known as the wood dealer system to solve both of these problems, to access southern land and labor. And this system used local power brokers and layers of formally independent contracting to insulate the mills from the costs, the risks, and the liabilities of managing a logging force as their employees, and creating an arm's length relationship between the mills and the woods workers. And I spent a lot of time in the book discussing this whole relationship and how it came to be. This picture is from North Florida around 1947, and it captures some of the aspects of these relationships. It suggests how this very flexible and efficient system of logging from the mill's perspective was built on severe inequalities of race and class and depended upon the vulnerabilities of these rural laborers. Needless to say, logging in the southern woods, as in other parts of the country, was very difficult and dangerous work. In fact, logging was long the most dangerous occupation in America. I think up until the late 1990s, it was the most dangerous occupation in America. And the South had a higher proportion of death and serious injury than any other region of the country. Now, this is Margaret Bork White again. Feeding these mills with a dependable supply of timber was critical to the economic success of the mills, as was maintaining order and stability in the mill labor force. So moving sort of from upstream, the industrialization of the forest, the logging, now thinking about labor in the mills. Just let me say a couple things very briefly about that, and then I will get to groundwater, right? Because of these investments, because of the size of these investments and the imperative to keep these mills going all the time to be able to recover those investments, right? There was a premium on order and stability in the mill labor forces. And the pulp and paper industry, when it moved into the South, it brought its union contracts with it. This was a heavily unionized industry, okay? And these were very good, high-paying union jobs, much better than the jobs out in the woods, and much better than many jobs in other southern industries, okay? And because of that, in the kind of fight that divided the working class in the South for so long, the unions created segregated locals and separate lines of progression for black and white workers that made it all but impossible for black workers to get access to the better, higher-paying jobs. And Timothy Minchin's book, The Color of Work, is really the best source for this part of the story. It took courageous activism on the part of black workers and the federal government acting under the power of the new civil rights laws to open this up. In the 1960s, the pulp and paper industry was the most litigated industry in the South. There's a whole story here as well about pollution, downstream pollution issues, air and water pollution in particular, which I won't be able to talk about today because I need to talk about groundwater, obviously. Let me go back to this real quick. So making paper requires massive amounts of water, and pulp and paper making is really just a big cook, right? You get the fiber, you chip it, you get the trees, you chip it, and you cook it. And you can think of the mills, and these are diffusers, so this is where, these aren't the digesters where you cook the chips, these are the diffusers where you wash the pulp, which also requires enormous amounts of water before you lay it out on a paper machine to make the paper. Now, you can think of these mills as huge concentrating agents that are pulling pulpwood, chemicals, energy, and water together to create this big cook and to dissolve the tough lignins that make wood hard and to liberate the long fibers needed to make paper. And water is arguably the most important of all the inputs used in making paper because it has no substitute. You can find substitutes for pulpwood, right? You can use recycled paper. You can other types of fiber and other types of wood, but water has no substitute. And it has been, in a somewhat contradictory way, one of the most poorly managed resources used by the pulp and paper industry, in stark contrast to the way that the industry approached its timberlands. So groundwater was always preferable to surface water because it typically did not require any sort of pre-treatment, and it was essentially free other than the cost of pumping. So as it turned out, one of the great advantages of coastal Georgia and other parts of the southeastern coastal plain for pulp and paper mills was this plentiful supply of high-quality groundwater from what we now know as the Floridan Aquifer. Okay. So the Floridan Aquifer system, this is a map of the pre-development state of the Floridan Aquifer system, and it's sometimes divided into an upper Floridan Aquifer and a lower Floridan Aquifer, but they basically, I think, have realized that this is all operating as one. I told you I'm not a hydrogeologist, but we call it the Floridan Aquifer system now. It covers about 100,000 square miles in parts of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, and it's one of the most prolific aquifers in the world. And this map provides a model of what hydrologists in the 1980s considered to be the pre-development state of the Floridan Aquifer. So if we go back to what David Hurst Thomas was talking about, right, and he's talking about ships floating around out off the coast of Savannah, filling up with fresh water. Well, that's what that gray area is. That's discharge of fresh water out of the aquifer out into the ocean. It's just tremendous if you think about it, this discharge way out into the ocean. Okay, and the blue is recharge area. So this aquifer is this sort of living system that's recharging from all the rainfall further up and then basically flowing down towards the coast and towards the ocean. Okay, some of this water was literally thousands of years old and had been working its way through this limestone formation on its journey to the Atlantic Ocean before being discharged. And although many people, right, knew about the prolific nature of the groundwater resource, the artesian wells, right, the existence of a system of regional groundwater flow was not really recognized until the mid-1930s. And it was not until the 1950s that geologists recognized that all of these carbonate formations were functioning as a single unit and gave it the name the Floridan Aquifer. By the 1970s and 80s, with the development of computer simulations, hydrogeologists were able to develop a better, more quantitative understanding of flow rates through the aquifer and the ability to start to visualize what was happening, okay? And so these models were used to generate these maps and some of the others that I'll show in a minute. Okay. Now, the development of the aquifer started in the late 19th century before anyone really understood the true state of the resource and its extent. The earliest artesian or deep bore well in Georgia was bored in Savannah in 1882, and the boring of other wells soon followed. These wells, quote, were free-flowing and furnished a most desirable quantity of water, according to one observer. This is a technical term, potentiometric surface, which is the level that the water from the confined aquifer would reach once a well is dug, right, was 35 feet above sea level in Savannah. So the first wells they drop in Savannah, right, they've got water flowing up naturally to 35 feet above sea level, okay? Hold that thought. All right. This is a picture of the Savannah pumping station around 1911, and it provided most of the city's water. Pumping rates were roughly 10 million gallons a day during this time, okay? 20, 30 years later, the pulp and paper industry moves in, okay? And this is the Brunswick mill, okay? As I said, one of the many reasons why coastal Georgia, and this is also 1940s, one of the many reasons why coastal Georgia was so attractive to the industry was this prolific groundwater resource. When Union Bag started its Savannah mill in 1936, it began pumping slightly more than 7 million gallons a day. 6 years later, it was pumping 18 million gallons a day. By 1954, it was pumping 30 million gallons a day, and total withdrawals in the Savannah area, right, had risen to about 55 million gallons a day, okay? Now, here's a little law. It's the only law I'll do all day, I promise, okay? As far as the law governing groundwater use went, there wasn't any, basically, or very little. Until quite recently, groundwater use was essentially unregulated in most states, subject to the so-called rule of capture or the law of absolute dominion, which, as the name suggests, basically meant that a property owner could pump as much water as they wanted to. And the logic of this was vividly illustrated by this quote from John Ray, the executive vice president of Union Camp. Some states claimed to adhere to a reasonable use standard, which they borrowed from the common law, riparian law governing surface water in the East, but it was very difficult to police this, right? Groundwater is a classic common pool resource, and governments have had a very difficult time all over the world regulating its use. And as a result, in so many other parts of the United States, and for much of the 20th century, withdrawals from the deep aquifers underlying the Georgia coastal plain were essentially unregulated. And the result of all this pumping, much of it again associated with the paper industry, meant or created significant changes in the aquifer. And so what we get are significant cones of depression created under these areas of large withdrawals: Savannah, Brunswick, Jessup, Fernandina Beach. You can see in this map from 1980 the decline in that potentiometric surface under these areas of intensive pumping. So what does that mean? That means there's this big cone of depression created under Savannah and Chatham County, where once the groundwater was rising 35 feet above sea level, suddenly you've got a cone of depression now which is 100 or more feet below sea level. What does that do? That starts to pull in salt water from out in the coastal areas, right? And so Hilton Head is getting saline intrusion, and this is already starting to happen, we think, in the sort of 50s and 60s, although it doesn't really become a big issue until the 70s, 80s. Brunswick has a little bit of saline intrusion. Tybee now has a little bit of saline intrusion. So if you get that gradient, it's all physics. Water's going to flow. The groundwater's going to start flowing in the other direction, down that gradient into that cone of depression. Okay, so instead of those pre-development discharges into the ocean, right, groundwater is flowing back the other way, drawing salt water into the parts of the aquifer underneath Hilton Head, Brunswick, and Tybee. And I think this is a really good illustration of one of those changing edges that Mart Stewart was talking about in his keynote address. Now, this wasn't really fully appreciated and understood, right, at the time or sort of in the middle of the century when pumping was starting to increase, but there were people who were raising concerns. So Arthur J. Funk, who was a Savannah High School physics professor, warned in 1938 of the possibility that increased pumping in the area could lead to saltwater intrusion. And it really is just physics, right? A USGS study from 1945 found for the first time that large cones of depression were forming under Savannah, Brunswick, and other areas because of large industrial withdrawals. By the late 1950s, there was some evidence of saltwater intrusion in the Brunswick area. And in 1964, scientists from the U.S. Geological Survey concluded on the basis of new data and current pumping rates that saltwater intrusion would begin to significantly affect outlying coastal areas in less than 100 years, and urged that the maximum level of pumping at Savannah should be around 40 million gallons a day. At the time, it was about 62 million gallons a day. Okay? By 1970, pumping in the Savannah area had risen to almost 70 million gallons per day. It peaked in 1990 at about 88 million gallons a day. And that forced water levels, this cone of depression, down to about 125 feet below sea level. So from 35 feet above to 125 feet below. According to one U.S. Geological Survey scientist, we don't know how much more this aquifer can stand. Rock Howard, you gotta love that name, of the Georgia Quality Control Board was somewhat more direct. The Ocala limestone is probably the largest aquifer in the world, but it is a fragile thing in a certain sense and a rare thing that ought to be protected. As for the prospect of saltwater intrusion, Howard noted that, quote, it might not happen tomorrow, maybe not for 50 years, but sure as the world it is coming. Not surprisingly, Union Camp took a somewhat different perspective. Despite mounting evidence of saltwater encroachment in outlying areas, Executive Vice President John Ray stated that the aquifer had not even been strained. Now, it was around this time that, and really, you can't make this up, right? Ralph Nader and his group come to Savannah to study the environmental crisis, right? So James Fallows, Nader actually didn't come, but James Fallows and the rest of Ralph Nader's study group, known as Nader's Raiders, descended on Savannah to study what they referred to as the environmental crisis in the region. And much of their attention was directed at Union Camp, and their resulting book, The Water Lords, published in 1971, focused heavily on groundwater use and water pollution and other issues. Author and project director James Fallows did not pull any punches in his criticism of Union Camp's, quote, arrogant assumption that it could use unlimited amounts of groundwater. But his pleas for new laws that would force the industry to take a more prudent approach to groundwater use fell on deaf ears, despite a new set of regulations in 1972 that required an Environmental Protection Division permit for withdrawals of more than 100,000 gallons per day. For most of the 1970s and 80s, groundwater use was not a major issue in Savannah and southeast Georgia. Most of the immediate concerns more immediate concerns with air and water pollution dominated the public agenda as new laws and regulations were enacted to deal with the massive pollution loads caused by American industry. Just a couple of facts here as a sidebar. In the early 1960s, before the enactment of federal water pollution control laws, the pulp and paper industry was discharging nationally about 1.6 trillion gallons of wastewater a year, accounting for about a fourth of the total organic wastewater pollution generated by all of American industry. And reflected in that aggregate number, of course, was substantial amounts of wastewater generated by particular mills in particular locations, doing enormous damage to local landscapes and livelihoods. And I spent a lot of time in my book talking about this. In the 1940s, the Spring Hill, Louisiana mill that I showed you a picture of earlier, the one with all the wood in the wood yard, was discharging wastewater into the surrounding bayou at a rate of 10,000 gallons per minute, untreated wastewater, 10,000 gallons a minute. 40 years later, Champion International's mill in Canton, North Carolina, was discharging 3 times that amount and diverting the entire average flow of the Pigeon River. In the late 1960s, Union Camp Savannah Mill was discharging as much organic waste into the lower Savannah River as a city of 700,000 people. Now, this is, again, one of my photos, not Margaret Bourke White. This is the Savannah Mill, looking at it from across the aerated waste ponds that were created in 1970 to deal with these water pollution loads, right? And it took a long struggle and strong federal water pollution control laws, what we now know as the Clean Water Act, to force reductions of these pollution loads. And the solution had really never been that difficult. I mean, there's some toxics issues for sure. We can talk about those. But the solution to the big, gross, organic pollution loads was never that hard. These wastes just needed time to decompose, time and space to decompose, right? They were basically using up all the dissolved oxygen and suffocating rivers when they were pumped into those rivers and giving them time and aerating them in these lagoons, and these are this is on the island across from the mill, really helped solve much of the problem. And in 1970, as I said, in the wake of a federal enforcement conference, Union Camp engaged in a substantial upgrade of its wastewater treatment operations and established these aerated lagoons to deal with that problem. There are other pollution issues for sure, so I'm not suggesting that they were completely solved. But there was a lot of progress to make. Groundwater, on the other hand, was sort of a non-issue throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s. The so-called decade of the environment of the 1970s, it really was not much of an issue here and was not discussed in any detail. But it did surface again in the late 1980s as new data and improved modeling of the Floridan aquifer revealed or suggested an increased threat of saltwater encroachment under some of the coastal islands, such as Hilton Head. More important, as evidence of saltwater intrusion under Hilton Head Island accumulated, the state of South Carolina, and I say this as a South Carolinian, right, the state of South Carolina threatened to sue the state of Georgia, contending that Georgia's failure to control overpumping in Savannah and Chatham County was destroying the integrity of the aquifer under Hilton Head and other areas of coastal South Carolina. Freddie Vang, the executive director of South Carolina's Water Resources Commission, put the matter this way in 1991, quote, "Either we sit down and solve the problem in a scientific manner, or we go to the lawyers." Now, God help us if we have to go to the lawyers. And by this time, 6 pulp and paper mills in coastal Georgia accounted for about 60% or 215 million gallons per day of all permitted withdrawals from the Floridan aquifer in the state of Georgia. And for the rest of the 1990s and the 2000s, Georgia and South Carolina went back and forth on the issue. By the late 1990s, Georgia starts to get serious about this, and Georgia regulators start to think about reducing or capping and then reducing pumping rates. In 1997, the Georgia Environmental Protection Division released an interim strategy establishing guidelines for groundwater use in southeast Georgia as a prelude to a long-term groundwater management strategy that would be put in place in the mid-2000s. As long as there is significant pumping in southeast Georgia, the 1997 document concluded saltwater intrusion is irreversible. And in 2006, the state established a regime that effectively capped and then started to reduce pumping in various areas, including in the red zone, the Chatham County area here around Savannah. Savannah and International Paper, which bought the Union Camp Mill in the late 1990s, reduced their total pumping, drawing on expanding surface water through an expanded treatment facility that Savannah had created in the late 1990s. And by 2010, pumping in the Savannah-Chatham County area for both International Paper and industrial and municipal pumping was down to about 50 million gallons a day from a high of 88 in 1990. So it's back to levels that had prevailed in the middle of the 20th century. That's progress. That's a lot of progress, right? So looking back, the groundwater crisis in South Georgia, like so many other places around the world, is really a failure of regulation. It's a failure of governance. It's a failure to value the resource. It's a failure to price it, as economists would argue. But mostly it's a failure of politics. It's a failure to recognize collectively that this is a public shared common pool resource that needs to be approached with care, one that will surely be ruined if subjected to a relentless industrial logic of extraction operating according to the law of absolute dominion. Now, we know that there are many successful examples throughout history of management regimes for common pool resources in many different kinds of societies around the world, but in a modern industrial economy, I would submit that we need government and that the public that stands behind that government is even more important, to regulate and govern the use of this kind of resources. Groundwater is one of our most underappreciated resources. 98% of the fresh water on Earth that is not locked up in ice sheets and glaciers is groundwater, not surface water, groundwater. And because it is not visible, because it is so hard to see, so hard to make a part of the places that we live in, we take it for granted. Its invisibility begets neglect, misuse, and waste. But it is a fragile resource, and it's one that scientists have helped us to learn how to see, and one that if we treat with care, if we manage it with an eye toward that overused but still meaningful word, sustainability, it can be part of the places that we make out of the land for a long time to come. So I want to close with a quote from Eugene Odom, who has been very popular these last few days, and some words about climate change. Odom, of course, was the son, was one of the most important ecologists of the post-World War II period, and the son of Howard Odom and the brother of Howard T. Odom. Howard Odom was the famous Southern regionalist who taught at the University of North Carolina for many years. He and Rupert Vance, I think, were really the first environmental social scientists in the United States, maybe in the world, and did enormous work on what was happening in the South in the 30s in particular. Now, as many of you know better than I, Eugene Odom spent most of his career at the Institute of Ecology at the University of Georgia and spent a fair amount of time on the Georgia coast where he witnessed firsthand the ecological disruptions caused by the paper industry. His systems-oriented approach to ecology and his ideas of balance and equilibrium, though not embraced by contemporary ecologists, influenced many of the early environmental laws with their emphasis on restoring the proper balance between human activity and the environment. This quote is from a report on groundwater use in Georgia during the post-World War II period that he and his colleague Thomas James prepared for the 1989 Georgia Water Resources Conference. Quote, maintaining aquifer levels is especially urgent at this time when droughts are becoming more frequent because of global warming. Remember, this is 1989. And the demand for irrigation increases. Improving regulation is part but not all of the answer. Reducing current wasteful use is equally important. Large users such as paper mills should be encouraged to use more surface water and to recycle water. Conservation of groundwater for domestic, agricultural, and municipal use should also be stressed. Now is the time to consider various options that are both carrot, incentives, and stick, regulation, before the situation becomes really critical. Prevention is worth millions of dollars of cure. Georgia's underground water is one of its most valuable resources, more valuable in the long run than oil. Climate change will have and is having a major impact on coastal Georgia and will surely change the way people in the region think about and use water resources. There's a lot of uncertainty in the climate models when it comes to regional impacts over medium-term timescales, so it's hard to say if the southeast will experience more or less precipitation, how much temperatures will increase over what time frame, whether storms will be more intense or more frequent, and so forth. But if droughts do become more frequent or more severe or both, as some of the models suggest, this will have big implications for the aquifer and for saline intrusion and for everything else, right? Sea level rise could also accelerate the process of saltwater intrusion, creating more downward pressure on saltwater entering the aquifer and more points of entry, further changing that saltwater-freshwater interface that Mark Stewart spoke about. One thing we can say for sure is that the future will be quite different than the past and that the days of unregulated pumping are long gone. And there's a growing recognition across multiple constituencies and users that this is a fragile resource. It surely needs more care and protection than it's getting, but I think we can all look at the recent efforts to reduce and conserve as positive developments. We can look at the 20-year history of Savannah's efforts to conserve water as a very positive development. Who knows how much more work it will take? Surely a lot, maybe more than we can muster. We're moving into uncharted territory, but the ongoing effort to reduce the demands on the aquifer do provide evidence that things can change, that we can set to work trying to repair, even if only slightly, what years of destructive practices have done to keep working at restoring this incredibly prolific gift that is the Floridan aquifer. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions, and as with yesterday, I'll ask for you to wait for the microphone, and so that everybody can hear you.
Right here in the, oh, we're waiting on the microphone's going to, got
here,
it.
and
We'll
then
follow the
right here,
microphone.
yeah.
Hello, my name is Zelda Tenenbaum. My question is, how do we use your presentation to continue to protect the Florida aquifer with the dredging of our river, the Savannah River by the ports, for the economic development of our industry and area? How do we use this to impact decisions that are being made now that are going to cause saltwater intrusion into the aquifer?
So I think that's a question for the whole group, but I have only just started to follow a little bit the dredging issue, and I have seen some stuff to suggest that it will exacerbate some of the saltwater intrusion problems. I know that's part of the discussion in the agenda, but I mean, this is your backyard, right? And I think that it's a huge issue going forward, especially, as I was saying at the end, if we end up in periods of more sustained drought. So drought plus dredging plus what's already happening is going to require faster, more significant reductions in the pumping for sure. The first thing I think is to start really reducing the pumping and get it down to manageable levels. And it's headed that way, but it's got a long way to go.
I have a question here. It's basically a rather simple question, but in the making of paper, is it absolutely impossible to use salt water as part of the process? I don't care whether the paper I'm touching here is salty or not. But presumably that is not possible, but could the process be shifted to the responsibility of the paper companies to have as part of their process desalinization plants?
You could, but that would probably undermine the competitiveness of those industries, globally. I mean, this industry, starting in the 1970s, was subjected to pretty significant global competition, and it's been essentially on this sort of modest decline ever since, right? So the industry really peaked in the South in the sort of 70s and 80s, and since then, we haven't seen, since 1986, a new pulp and paper mill built in the South. There is talk about a group of Chinese investors building a mill in Alabama or Mississippi, but I don't think that's happened yet. I don't think it's possible to use salt water, but I'm not a paper manufacturer. I know that they do need very clean, pure water. One of the reasons they've used the aquifers is because essentially they don't have to treat it, and it costs as much as 5 times or more to treat surface water than then use it in the pulp and paper mills. But absolutely, you could require new pulp and paper mills to use treated surface water. Right? There's a lot of surface water out in the Savannah River. Doesn't have to be salt water, and you could require that. And essentially, that's kind of where things are moving. So Savannah created this expanded industrial and domestic treatment system, or they expanded their system in the late 1980s, and the International Paper Mill, as I understand it, has been using more and more of water from that. They could also reuse and recycle a lot of their water, and so reduce the amount of water they're using per unit of product, if you will. And different mills use vastly different amounts of water. So this mill is not a huge water user compared to other mills per unit of product. The Jessup Mill, for example, a specialty pulp mill, and the Brunswick Mill, which bleaches, those use a lot more water per unit of product. And so it also depends on the type of product.
Thank you.
Oh. And there's one in the middle that needs the mic there.
Oh, hi. I'm Madeline Russell, and I have a question about, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh.
I don't know why I'm listening in the microphone, but yeah. Are you in there?
So I have an interesting question. You've got this industry that's pulling up the aquifer, so there's a lack of trust there. And then you said that there's a lack of political will that didn't come and regulate. So the solution is regulation. And my question is, before you come in with regulation, don't you need to do something about that broken trust?
So that's exactly what I was trying to suggest, that the solution is, or that this is a failure of regulation and governance, but is behind that is a failure of politics, right? And within that, I think restoring sort of trust and creating, true multi-stakeholder processes where everybody has a voice and can make a claim as part of the public on this resource, I think is really important. When I was here in the late 90s, it was very clear that was, we were a long way away from that. And I would be curious in kind of thinking about this chapter in this book and trying to do some more research for this as to whether or not that situation has improved and perhaps there is a bit more trust. It was a big issue when I was here in the late 1990s, and I've tried to kind of piece together the story since then. But I would love to hear from anyone who's sort of followed this and lived this, sort of your thoughts on this. I interviewed a bunch of people in the environmental community, people in the industry, people in the city, when I was here, but I need to kind of fill out that story, and I think you're absolutely right that at the end of the day, once you lose that trust, it takes a long time to build it back. But it is a way forward, right? And these are collaborative processes that are starting to take shape around some of these resources, and there is a recognition here. And I think when we see action like this, we can suggest, oh, it's not enough, it'll never be enough, but we need to realize, right, any step in the right direction is a step in the right direction, and that it's important to keep these processes moving forward. Oh, there was one here in the middle, yeah.
Yes, sir. You mentioned that they had reduced the amount of groundwater that's being withdrawn. I've got really two questions. One, have they seen a improvement in the potentiometric surface? And also, do they have a goal of what the sustainable water withdrawal from the aquifer is at this point?
So the goal in that 1997 strategy document that I mentioned, and then again in the 2006 kind of regime that was created, was to stop the intrusion of salt water. And to do that, they need to basically get that potentiometric surface way back up. And by definition, when you reduce pumping, that is going to start to rise again. But it sort of depends on what's happening in other parts of the aquifer as well. This is why drought becomes so important too, right? If we're getting more drought and sea level rise, then the aquifer itself is not recharging as fast as it was. It's not as prolific as it was. And the sea level rise could be pushing further salt water further down into the aquifer. So all of those things, I think, need to be in the mix. And this is why we are in uncharted territory here in terms of thinking about a management regime for this. I think the first step has been taken to recognize there needs to be a management regime, right? This needs to be regulated, and this is a precious and fragile resource that we need to take very seriously, even though it's been invisible and neglected for so long.
I had a question that's a little more about ecology. You mentioned earlier about in the 1930s that the idea of using woods or timber as less as a mine and more as a crop. That's pretty significant. I'd never really thought of it that way. Was there a person or any movement that made that change from this kind of slash and burn to more of this renewable resource? Was there a person or a visionary that changed the idea, going from being a mine where you draw it and leave to a crop where you keep growing it?
So there's a great book on that. It's called The Slain Wood, and it's right out there. Yeah. But the whole first chapter deals exactly with that question. There was not a single visionary. There were a lot of people involved in that transition. My argument is that it was the coming of the pulp and paper industry that drove that. Because of these massive investments in fixed capital, you couldn't pick up and move a pulp and paper mill. Some of these sawmills you could move around and follow the timber. Timber was gone, move on, okay? And with pulp and paper mills, you build a multi-$100-million complex, you need continuous sources of fiber. And that's what really drove this. There were a lot of New Deal agricultural policies, and then later the Soil Bank program and other programs that created structural incentives, tree farm programs, changes in tax law. All of this stuff is happening to drive this transition. And it is a huge ecological transition. I mean, this is the environmental history of the contemporary South in some ways, or big parts of the South.
Hi, I have the mic over here. I'm over here. Wave my hands. So I feel compelled to speak because that was exactly what I was going to bring up, the lady over here about the dredging of Savannah River. And I think that's where we have shifted our concern, and it's a crisis. Many of us in the environmental community have worked very hard to try to tell people, the Corps of Engineers actually don't believe dredging this river is a good idea. They're doing it because of politics. And one reason is Kasim Reed, who's mayor of Atlanta, talk about politics, has lobbied Obama to get the money to dredge the Savannah River, which I think is unconscionable that he's putting us at risk and he doesn't have accountability here. So sorry, I'm a bashing Reed. I live in Atlanta and work for the city of Atlanta. But anyway, point is, my father, Jim Henry, did a lot of the work on the Cone of Depression and the saltwater intrusion, and I do want to say I have the research. It's Miocene fissures that are underlaying here, and the more pressure of water and that sea level rise and the storm surge coming in to the Savannah River is going to put pressure on those fissures. We don't know exactly where they are, and once the salt's in there, it's in there. And so we do need to, all of us, really pressure our politicians. This is a bad idea. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment, and I would love to talk to you after this, if at all possible. One more.
Hey, thanks, William. I want to go back to one of your other kind of solutions that you were kind of talking through in terms of the politics and the regulation. And one of the things that has been suggested at various times over the last 20 years is that one way to value the water is to literally put a price on it and to think about shifting from some sort of regulated riparian tradition that we're in to some form of an appropriations, that kind of a prior appropriation that's not uncommon west of the Mississippi. And I am curious, based on your experience kind of working nationally as well as internationally and experience in law, is there any example of a situation in a regulated riparian situation where there is a way, and I'm not advocating for this is just a kind of a thought question, is there any kind of example in a regulated riparian situation, say east of the Mississippi, in which there is some sort of appropriation of water? And this is, in some ways, I mean, I don't disagree with you that water is not appreciated and valued, but I also I kind of get my hackles up when we kind of start talking about putting some sort of price on it, because usually that goes with some sort of commodifying or privatization of the resource, which I am not in support of. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I agree with that, and I think there's some examples around the world of water markets that are working. Australia, I think, has some water markets that are working fairly well. There's been a lot of discussion about this out west with trying to create water markets and transfers. I certainly take the point that kind of putting a price on this resource and then making that fungible and transferable could create all kinds of problems, for sure. But essentially, a zero sort of cost for an industry that can continue to pump as much as they want is not exactly a great solution either. So having some sort of regime where people pay their way and try to pay for some of the damage and the externalities that are created, I think is a better way to think about it. Whether or not it becomes a tradable commodity or it's a slippery slope to a tradable commodity, I think is a harder question. I think we're already in some ways entering a sort of quasi-appropriation regime here where you've got permits, right? And so permits that have been created essentially are sort of usufructory rights that almost look like they're a type of entitlement in a sense, right? They're a type of entitlement. They're not full-fledged property rights. There has been an interesting case in Texas where some folks, when Texas moved to a permitting system to try to control overpumping of the groundwater, they successfully sued for takings and said, law of absolute dominion, this is our resource. You can't force us to reduce and make us get a permit. I don't think those cases are going anywhere nationally, though, and there have been a lot of cases nationally that have sort of skirted around that question, so I don't see that happening. But it is, when you start to create different kinds of entitlements, right, any lawyer will tell you that all kinds of unintended consequences will ensue for sure.
Paul said you can get a bonus question.
Oh,
You have such a
I have a bonus.
bonus question.
I just had a question. We've been talking about taking water out, but what about the issues of that big city inland pumping water out of our rivers through their faucets and into the Chattahoochee, and also about the proposal to take water from the rivers and inject it into the aquifer by private industry?
So I haven't heard about the injection proposal. That sounds quite dangerous to me because once you pollute a groundwater resource, you will never clean it up. So I would be very nervous about any of that. I mean, there's a natural recharge that's happening, and we need to try to protect those recharge areas for sure. Atlanta water politics, wow, that's whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting over territory there. And having watched this from afar, I've been sort of amazed at how intense the politics are becoming there with the proposals for interbasin transfers and all of that. Now you've got a couple more big units going up at the Vogel plant that's going to take a lot of water out of the Savannah River. Again, if we're entering a period of sustained droughts and stuff, it's not a pretty picture for sure. Now there's a lot of water in the southeast. no doubt. And, we haven't really had a lot of experience moving water around in the way they have out west. That could be a big part of the future, though, if you're in a water scarce or strained situation. And that creates all kinds of environmental problems, for sure, and creates all kinds of, distributional issues, too. Thank you.